Living fully alive in every way. You're listening to Relationship Prescriptions with Dr. Carol.
Welcome again, friends. It's Dr. Carol, and this is Relationship Prescriptions. I have a friend with me today that I think you will get some fascinating and encouraging information from, Dr. Glenn Harper. Thank you, Dr. Harper, for being with us on the program.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Dr. Harper is a neurosurgeon. Yes, it is brain surgery for Dr. Harper. He works here at Seton Brain and Spine here outside of Austin, Texas. But Dr. Harper's experience and expertise goes far beyond brain surgery. His undergraduate training was in psychology and religion. Then, of course, medical school. He went to Baylor School of Medicine, neurosurgery training in San Antonio, and now here in Austin. Dr. Harper also is very involved in medical missions. Let me just start, Dr. Harper, by asking, what do you do in the medical missions? Just a short capsule of that part of your life.
Sure. We are a fairly new medical mission group, and currently we have two parts to the mission. We do a community mission with some primary care services where we're traveling to the southern portion of Mozambique and helping people who have difficult access to care. And then we have a surgical portion of the mission where we're currently doing spine surgery as well as general surgery and some other hospital-related activities such as emergency medicine.
Where do you do these surgeries? So is it like you take a mini surgical practice and go to these places that need it and do things that they can't do there themselves?
You know, we have partner neurosurgeons that are in Mozambique.
Okay.
And one of the biggest problems there in terms of the spine aspect is they don't have access to the hardware. Mozambique is one of the 10 poorest countries on earth. And so the hardware that we put in for fusions is fairly expensive. And so we have partnered with a number of the large companies here in the United States who have, continually donate hardware. We're able to bring that over and not only provide the care for patients, but more importantly, we are helping train the new residents coming through, teaching them how to put in the hardware, letting them recognize what the values of the various surgical procedures are and how to do those so that they can further the field for Mozambique.
Awesome. That's exciting.
It is.
What I want, though, to focus on during our conversation today has to do more with wellness for all of us.
Yes.
Your perspective is kind of unique with your undergraduate training on the psychology side and then all the anatomy and surgery and also your deep involvement in ministry and missions and the church. From your perspective, talk a bit about how those various areas of us impact each other. I think sometimes we can get so tied up in, is this a anatomical problem? Is it a chemistry problem? Is it a spiritual problem? Do I just need to pray? Talk a bit how, from your perspective, those things impact each other.
You know, I think that's a great topic because God didn't make us as individual parts. He made us all together. And the fact is, the parts work together. And so when I see a patient, one of the things that I'm continually thinking about, you know, I may be talking about surgery. I may be talking about a very anatomical thing that we're doing to affect a physiology. But I'm constantly thinking about the psychology of what that patient's going through just hearing about surgery. And we think about the spirituality. You know, all of us recognize that troubles come in our life. And the Bible promises that that's going to happen. It says,
in fact, Jesus said, you will have trouble.
You will have trouble. But he follows that up with, take heart, for I have overcome the world.
Yes.
And so all of that works together. And so it's a constant balance for us to be thinking about at any one time, which is sort of the thing that's taking the forefront of my life, but none of the others ever takes a complete backseat.
Yeah. Have you, in your practice, seen times where somebody thinks it's a biochemical problem, or maybe their pain is primarily anatomy, but either the psychological or maybe the spiritual impacts are such a big factor there that, you know, surgery isn't the complete answer or prayer isn't the complete answer, and how those things have to all be used together?
I see that continually. I have a lot of patients who come with back pain. It turns out that one of the presenting symptoms of major depression is back pain. We turn that into a physical problem. And so it may be that depression is what needs to be treated, not the back pain itself. At other times, I'll have people who I will have done surgery on, and for me, it becomes fairly routine, but this is life-changing, sometimes life-shattering for these people. And as they recover from that, they don't know how to get past the psychology of this shattering of their life. Even though their body may be restored, they can't get past that. And so we often have conversations about how to address that, both from a psychological and a spiritual aspect, to get past that portion of their life.
That's a great point. The word may not be a real pleasant one, but almost a victim mentality to their physical dysfunction that has now been improved, but they have to learn how not to be sick.
That's true. I find that some people have been sick for so long that they have taken on the persona of that disease, so that everybody knows that Uncle Joe can't help set up the picnic because he's a back patient.
Yes.
And that's who he has become. And it's very hard once you do something to help them get out of that pain to then change who they are. That's a much bigger and much longer process that we have to get them in the right hands to help them through that.
Yeah. For somebody who is in the middle of a mess, whether it is a pain syndrome and they're living with pain, or the depression or whatever, let's maybe talk about what are some steps, what are some questions that people can ask, what are some steps they can go through to kind of, sort this out. Sometimes we need some help. Sometimes we can't do that ourselves, right?
That's absolutely right. We were made to be relational beings. We were made to relate to each other. And so oftentimes we have those to drive us to get help. I believe that there are some certain steps, and so certainly if it's a minor pain that's easily controlled and goes away quickly, maybe that's something you don't need help with. But if there's a pain or a discomfort in life that just seems like it's not going away or it's getting worse, I would say the first thing is to really seek medical attention, see a primary care provider, get the appropriate evaluations. Before you seek alternative medicine, things like that, you want to make sure there's not something really wrong. I have no problem with somebody, for example, who has been through all of the scans and the right steps medically, but we realize there's nothing severely wrong, and maybe they seek acupuncture that's gotten them out of pain. That's great. But what you don't want is to hide the pain. The pain is there to tell us something's wrong. And so you don't want to hide the bad problem by just treating the pain until you've ruled out the other things.
Yeah. You've mentioned alternative medicine or complementary medicine, and of course people can have very strong feelings about that, either positive or negative. But I do appreciate the way you put that in perspective, that it's not a replacement for the surgery or the medications when necessary, but there are some times when maybe that helps somebody function better, using all of God's creation in maximizing our wellness.
There's no question about it. I'll give you an example of that. Two different patients, for example. One patient who comes to me with a pinched spinal cord and they're losing function. That's somebody who we need to take the pinch off the spinal cord. That's a surgical disease, and all the acupuncture and chiropractic in the world is not going to take care of that problem. On the other hand, if we have somebody who comes with chronic back pain and we have done all the scans and find that there's nothing really surgical to do, then from my perspective, as long as it's safe practice, it doesn't matter to me how to get out of pain. There's the whole concept of placebo effect.
Yes.
That maybe a sugar pill will help. And quite frankly, at that stage, I don't care if the sugar pill helps. I don't care if it's a sugar pill, because if it helps restore some quality of life, that's what we're after.
And that whole impact of the mind on the body, I think you and I, the medical part of what I do and the medical part of what you do,
yes,
we see that powerfully. I know you have probably seen what I have seen too. People who are in severe dysfunction, and you do all you can on the medical side, but they are looking to you to fix them. And what they need to do is choose to take charge of living better. Physical, emotional, spiritual, the whole package. And people that continually look to their doctor or anyone to fix them can never get to that quality of life that I believe God wants us to have.
There's no question that the mindset coming into a surgery makes all the difference in terms of the outcome of the surgery. Certainly, the surgery has to go well, right?
Right.
Certainly, all of that can come into place. But there's also situations where a surgery can go absolutely perfectly, absolutely straight out of the textbook, and somebody not do well because they haven't chosen that ahead of time. And then there's other times that people choose to do well, the surgery goes well, and it still doesn't come out with the results that we hope for. And so not all of that is predictable. People nowadays are used to taking their car in and getting it fixed, and if it's not fixed, then they can take it back, but eventually it can get fixed. And unfortunately, it's not that way with the body. And so that's a part of the spiritual journey as well, part of the mental, emotional journey as well, is to recognize that as beings, as we get older, that there are things that will fail that we can't undo in medicine. That's one of the things I see people struggle with often, as somebody who's been a competitive athlete for all their life, and now in their 60s or 70s, all of a sudden something is failing, and they say, well, I've never been like this.
Right.
And that's a tough thing to deal with. And so that's part of the mental, emotional journey that we help people on.
You're talking about what I think we all at some point have to face, and that's what some theological writers call the already and the not yet. We live to the maximum for what God makes available here, but this is not as good as it gets. We still have to look toward eternity. We cannot experience everything here. We experience the reality of God's presence and healing and all of the wellness that is possible, but it's not enough.
It will never be enough. You know, the Bible says that we're aliens in this world, and we are meant to be in another place eventually, but God has a purpose for us here. And, you know, as you and I look back on our lives, we can look at that journey and see the times where we thought things were really negative, maybe ended up with a really positive outcome. There's a very famous Chinese parable about a man who had a horse and a son, both of whom he was very proud of. The horse ran away. Everybody thought it was horrible. The horse came back with other horses. Everybody thought it was wonderful. And to all of these things, eventually his son broke his arm, breaking one of the horses, and then the army came through and conscripted every able-bodied young man. But the son was left behind. All the others were certainly going to die, but he lived. And in any one of these circumstances, the man recognized you can't judge while you're going through it whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. Certainly that's not to say that there aren't some things that are bad that we can recognize at that time. But many of those things in life that we're judging as bad may turn out for good. I can't tell you how many people that I've had who've gone through a tough time and come out and have said, man, I have grown through this, and while I wouldn't have chosen it, I'm glad I went through this, and now I can help others, or now I can recognize other parts of who I am.
And isn't that part of the miracle working power of God? He takes what truly is painful or damaging or hurtful in a human way and turns it into something meaningful. He actually recreates out of the trauma or the pain something of meaning or blessing or bread whereby we can then feed others.
That's exactly right. You know, he says that all things work together for good for those who trust him. And so that's really what it comes down to. I think the thing that I constantly have to remind myself is to trust him in any situation I am, because he can see the whole picture. We know this is a God outside of space and time.
Yes.
And he can see the beginning and the end because he's living them simultaneously. And we cannot. We have no idea where the current portion of our journey is going to lead. And so to trust him is the major thing that we can do to really benefit our own lives.
We live inside of time. God created us inside of time, and I'm sure he understands that. But he isn't. He isn't bound by our time perspective.
That's right. He's beyond that because he created time. And so that is a really hard concept because we are meant to be inside of time. It's a hard concept to fathom. It's interesting, though, when I travel to Africa, to Kenya and Mozambique, and especially when we get outside of the major cities, there's a different concept of time. There's also a different concept of spirituality that's much more enrolled in their portion, in their everyday lives than it is for most of us here in the U.S. And so it's really fascinating to see that separation of how they're not so bound by time like we have done to ourselves here.
Talk about that for a second. I think that makes me curious what the differences are, because I think we do get so hurried, especially in our Western culture, that we can't see beyond the moment. But people who don't have all that we have are not bound by some of the things that we take for granted. Talk about how their experience is different.
You know, it's interesting when you talk about not being bound by things, and that's one of the things that I see the most. It's interesting to go visit these wonderful people who have experienced real joy, and you look and they really have nothing. And then we come back and we see people who have everything at their disposal, and they have really buried joy, and they can't find joy anymore. It gets stuck in all of the things that we have. And I notice how easily people want to help each other there. We had an experience where we were, our driver over there, we have a driving service we consistently use, and our driver was driving us in the minivan, and we got stuck at one point. One of the vans did, and the other van was up ahead, and so we just had to back up to get to him. By the time we backed up there were already 3 other cars stopped to help before we could even get there. That's how eager they are to help each other, and we see it all the time. As this travesty has just occurred in Beira, which is a city in the middle of Mozambique, a cyclone has just hit. A city of 500,000 people, wiped out what little infrastructure they had. As I've been communicating with my my colleagues down in Maputo, which is far in the south of Mozambique, they have been talking about how they are together putting resources together, food and water and clothes and everything they can spare to send up there. These are people who have nothing, and yet they're giving it to these people who have lost what little they had. And so how joyful that is, what a refreshing thing to restore confidence in the human spirit.
Yes. And that reminds me of what Paul said, I have learned whether I have little or much to be content.
That's it. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
It's a hard lesson to learn. And unfortunately, I believe for most people, you have to go through some loss, as Paul did, even to the loss of freedom, in Paul's case, to be able to learn that.
Yeah. As a physician, are there any moments or vignettes, obviously not with any personal patient information, but just moments where you have seen God's intervention connect with medical care in helping somebody get past a challenge, where God's intervention has made a difference?
You know, I see God's intervention, I sort of categorize that in 3 different segments that I see. One is miraculous, right? And quite frankly, we don't see that often, but fortunately in our profession we get an occasion to see it. And I can share with you about a young man, it was actually in Mozambique, who a couple of years before I met him had fallen off of a bridge that was being built and had broken his back, had damaged his spinal cord. He was not paraplegic, but he clearly had what we call a spastic gait, which is a problem with spinal cord that's now irreversible after 2 years. We ended up operating on him just to straighten his back out to relieve back pain. And within a few days, he was not only walking upright, but his spinal cord was functioning completely normally. That can only be attributed to miraculous. But those are few and far between. I would say most of the things that people look at and see as miraculous, we can probably medically describe that somehow, or at least give good defense as to how the body could heal. The other places that I see it out of miraculous, I see God intervene oftentimes in end-of-life discussions.
Yes.
Not so much with the patient, who in my world, most of those patients are comatose and or beyond that, to the edge of brain death when we're having those discussions. But as God intervenes, it's with the families. And as we talk about the issues and the families begin to understand that this is a transition time, to watch the peace of God come over these families at the right time, that in itself seemed miraculous to me. Even to the point that I had a young lady a number of years ago who was about 30. She had just delivered her 5th child. She had a massive intracerebral hemorrhage.
Wow.
We operated, tried to get her through that. She passed away, and the patient's mother and father afterward said, "Can we pray with you, Dr. Harper?" And as we stood in the hall and prayed, they prayed a prayer entirely for me. How selfless is that? That can be nothing other than God's intervention to give them that sort of insight and comfort and wisdom to be able to do that. And obviously they had to go through all the steps of grieving, but the fact that they could see the bigger picture was amazing to me. And I would say the third place that I see it is there's a lot of fear for people coming to see a neurosurgeon.
True, yes.
In general, we're talking about either surgery for brain or surgery for spine, both of which has enormous consequences. These people are usually at a really bad point in their life. Many people are. And so getting to see a neurosurgeon can be a very daunting thing. And so as I sit and talk with the patients and watch them get the understanding of what's really going on, and then talk about the aftercare and the things, again, oftentimes I could see that piece, and many of my patients wish to pray with me. And as we do so, we get to really see God's peace come over these people, so that they came in at one moment terrified of what's going to happen, and a mere 30 minutes later, they're at peace with it and ready to go and ready to do what needs to be done. So that's an amazing thing that happens.
The story that you shared about that 30-ish young mother,
yes.
That really touches my world, the OBGYN part of me,
yes.
The risks at that moment, and the juxtaposition of new life and the end of life.
That's
right there. It reminds me that as physicians, we have the privilege of ministering to people at some of those moments, but that our hands are limited. And God's presence in those moments, both for the patients and the families, and that when we imagine that this life is enough, like we talked about at the beginning of our conversation, we miss so much.
We do.
This life is such a small moment.
That's right.
In the big picture, both for those of us like you and I, ministering to those people physically, but also just in the whole perspective of our emotional pain, of our relationships. Eternity is a very long time.
It's a very long time, isn't it? Yes, and we think about the billions of people who have walked this earth. And
yes.
You think about the lifespan of any one of them as such a short piece of that time, and yet we have so much to look forward to. And yet I look at it that this is somewhat of a training ground. This is a place that God wants us to train so that we can have our fullest life once we get to heaven. It's also a place that we can encourage others to come with us. And that's the big part of ministry, is to help each other through the troublesome times that we have, and hopefully encourage others to come along with us.
The heart of ministry, being the hands and feet and heart and eyes of Jesus to those around us.
That's exactly what it is. Another place that I really see that is in the relationship aspect of what happens when we have these travesties. And to go back to that same example of the young lady who had just had her child, obviously she had 4 other children. Her husband had the 4 other children at that time. The parents were not available. And so one of the other things, the blessings that I got to see, is the nurses rallied. They figured out that there was a daycare center not far away, and they were able to get all the children cared for so that the husband could be really present in the moment and not have to worry about the kids, not have to do all the other functions. And so we really saw a whole group of people coming together to help this one young lady and this one family. That is such a joy to see that God's love spreads out in so many ways that way.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Harper, this has been a delightful discussion. I thank you so much for just talking about the integrated parts of who we are, body, soul, and spirit, the way God created us, and how you are bringing that reality to people here and across the world, and pointing toward eternity.
Well, I thank you for what you do, and this the joy and hope that you are giving people through this program, so thank you.
That conversation makes me think of those tests that you probably took when you were in school a whole long time ago. Remember those multiple choice questions, A, B, C, but then there was often a D or an E, all of the above. And when we are dealing with just about any challenge, especially when it relates to the intersection of our physical health, our spiritual health, and our relationships, usually it's all of the above. Taking steps to get the appropriate help, inviting God's intervention in prayer, walking that out day after day, that can certainly give us the kind of life that we desire and that Jesus desires for us. Thank you so much for joining us. If you'd like to connect with Dr. Harper in some way, just leave me a message on the podcast page on our website, and we'll be happy to connect you. I'm also very happy to hear from you if you have a comment or a question, or perhaps a topic that you'd be interested in us addressing on an upcoming episode. And until next time, may God bless you.